The Labor Department's small office, tasked with ensuring contractors meet their affirmative action obligations, has been dismantled by the Trump administration. But like many other downsizing actions, this one was temporarily halted by a federal judge. Here with more on what this means for the people who work there and the contractors who have to report, Bloomberg Law's Rebecca Clark. Rebecca, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
All right, let's start with this first question. What is the Office of Federal Contractor Compliance?
Yes. So, the office, also known as OFCCP, had the power to, both enforce these affirmative action plans that companies that do business with the government had in place, as well as the ability to audit these companies to make sure that they're complying, with these plans that they have in place, as well as, not discriminating on the basis of race, sex, or anything else. And essentially sort of this extra level of compliance for companies that have contracts with the government compared to, the standard level of regulations that any other private company would have to follow to have in place.
And OFCCP is established in statute, correct?
Yeah. So OFCCP was established through this decades-old executive order, which sort of put it more vulnerable to having an administration come in and sort of overturn it, which is what we saw early in the Trump administration this year, through an executive order, rescinded the underlying executive order that established most of the OFCCP's power. So, they're sort of in the process of going through and seeing what's left of the office, and essentially the only statutory obligations that they have that wasn't from that executive order to enforce anti-discrimination laws against veterans and for disabled workers. And a big bulk of what they did sort of was through this executive order that, President Trump has come in and sort of easily overturned.
I see. So the statutory core of it remains, but the part that was created by executive order has now been overturned by the Trump administration.
Right. It's been overturned. And sort of what we're seeing now is a bit of confusion of, what's left and what companies should be able to do, what they can voluntarily do. And, if there's even a risk of things that they were doing before to comply, if that might make them even a bit more of a target, since some of this, what's happened with OFCCP and what the Trump administration has done has been tied a bit to their diversity, equity, and inclusion, anti-DEI work. Experts have said and lawyers have said that, what OFCCP was doing is sort of different than what, we might be thinking about with traditional DEI programs like affinity groups or leadership programs. But, especially some of the aspects of affirmative action plans, if there was any goal setting within those, has sort of been tied up into this, same initiative by the Trump administration. And, the executive order in which the president rescinded the executive order that established most of the OFCCP's power came from, one of these anti-DEI orders that the president put in place.
So let's back up to what the administration actually has done to OFCCP. If they've rescinded that executive order, they've also laid off most of the people in OFCCP, correct?
Right. So, there was a memo earlier this year that came out that suggested they were going to fire like 90% of the office. It's not a major office. They have about 500 employees nationwide. And what we've seen so far through emails to workers is, anyone who didn't take those deferred action or early retirement programs that were offered to many federal employees have been put on administrative leave and then received a notice saying, that they were going to be laid off. So that was most of their staff across the country. I think they have an office in the Dallas region that sort of remains, as well as some of their national office employees. The notes that went out to these workers said that the reasoning for this is because the bulk of the work they were doing is no longer in effect based on getting rid of this executive order, and that would be the reason for these layoffs. Some of that action now is a bit paused because of the ruling out of California that's sort of impacting these wider sets of layoffs. But right now, they're on administrative leave, and it's, heading in the direction of sort of this total upheaval of the office.
I'm speaking with Rebecca Clark. She's the labor reporter at Bloomberg Law. So, Rebecca, tell us a little bit more about what the current status is, that they're on pause. So these workers are in limbo, yes?
Right. These workers are in limbo, and I think even further back from receiving these notices, it was clear that once that executive order was in place that undid most of the responsibilities of the OFCCP, these workers were being told not to keep doing the work that they had been doing. So it wasn't only saying no new plans, it was anything that was under review, or if there were any audits, which were sort of common actions for the OFCCP, that was sort of on pause. So it seems like both the action of the agency is a bit paused, as well as now these workers who are set to be laid off is sort of paused. So it's a bit of a wait and see, it seems, right now.
Has the Secretary of Labor offered any clarification, any statements on what the future of OFCCP or these individuals are?
Yeah, so, I haven't seen much from the Secretary sort of weighing in on this. Another aspect of this that I've heard from workers is that they've also had very little direction from the office itself and from leaders to meet with them. Union representatives have been asking to meet with them, and it seems like there was media reports and obviously the executive order that came out publicly undoing the agency. Other than that, it seems like they've had very little direction about what was happening to the lead up of getting placed on administrative leave and laid off. It didn't seem like they had, many updates heading up to that point.
So what does this mean for the contractors who have these reporting requirements? Have the reporting requirements gone away? Do they still have to report? Is the system up and running? Is there anybody to check? How's that all working?
Yeah, so it seems like, from what they're saying, that these requirements are no longer in place. When I've talked to some, lawyers who work with companies, it seems like there's a little bit of a mixed bag in terms of recommendations. Some people saying you should still keep up with some of what you were doing before because it could just help you, find any blind spots of discrimination that could lead to action anyways. At the same time, I think some people are warning that, if you continue doing these actions that are no longer required, that might, make you a bit more of a target potentially for this administration, which has obviously not been hesitant to sort of look into companies and some of their action in this space. So it seems like those reporting requirements are gone, and it would be a bit more voluntary if companies choose to do that. But at the same time, obviously, it doesn't seem like there's a clear distinction yet of what might happen with the agency. I think, obviously there's also still the requirements, under the statutory obligations for veterans as well as disabled workers. That was something in a memo we reviewed from the director that was brought in for the OFCCP had said they were going to look through and see if those obligations could remain as well. So there might be an update there, although be a little bit more difficult since those come through Congress. But that's something I think that companies should be thinking about. Sort of, they still have those obligations under the law.
There's a lot of tensions there to manage between statutory obligations, executive order reporting, visibility, compliance. So that makes it really tough for contractors who are wanting to stay engaged with the federal government, but not wanting to be too obvious about how they approach this issue.
Yeah, it seems to be a bit of a confusing time right now to see, what they should do, and sort of, this system that's been in place for decades definitely seems to be becoming undone. I think it's just a little unknown exactly where it's heading right now.
So read the tea leaves for us. What do you think happens next, and on what timeline?
Yeah, I think the next thing that we'll be watching for is, what happens with this court order, with, the temporary restraining order that's in place, to see how that impacts the layoffs at OFCCP. I think there's a chance as well, where workers have been saying that they didn't necessarily follow the proper system, so there might be some action they could take there. But, I think unlike other agencies, since it was so much of the power was established through executive order, I think that does give the administration a bit more power. I know another push I've heard from some workers is trying to influence Congress to, reestablish this through a law that would be, keep the OFCCP in place more than it would be through an executive order. I think that might be a bit difficult with Congress these days as well. So I definitely think sort of on the most immediate